all of the gains in automation, it goes to the owner class. All you have to do is have everyone be an owner, and now suddenly any gain in automation is a gain for everybody. If you grow just one thing, it may not grow as well as if it grows with another thing. A good example of that is called the Three Sisters method of farming.
There is definitely multi-apartment buildings or multi-families that do pass this.
$100 million that they gave to Joe Rogan that they would kind of be out if they breach contract. Is that a bigger number, or is 2 billion a bigger number?
I don't know,
It's a
Zach.
tough one, I
It's
know,
really hard.
and maybe
This.
comparing numbers is not Jeremy Strong's. Gotta go kill a Jenny.
I still don't think you should kill her. I don't think it's a good idea.
It's a ghost, dude. Welcome back, everybody, to Bread Theory. Tonight I'm joined once again by Dan Platt of the Albany Albany Green Party. And yeah, how you doing tonight, Dan? It's been a while since we've been at it. Oh no, and I've lost your audio all of a sudden.
I turned it off.
Ah,
I'm carrying on. Usually less frazzled than other people about any current events that might have transpired in the last 2
yeah,
weeks.
yeah. I mean, it's been very
Uh,
exciting for a lot of people.
the
Um,
last 2 weeks, it was a week ago. I was tempted to make a TikTok where I rant about the fear mongering that because I thought it was just like a usual just progressives and me and leftists only who were posting about Agenda 2025
oh yes, my
and
God.
project.
Project 2025.
I'm confusing. My mind is always confusing with Agenda 21
Yeah,
because it was literally a cycle ago that all the right wingers were hair on fire about Agenda 2021, and if Biden wins in 2020, it will be Agenda 2021, and we'll all be forced to live in hobbit homes and recycle our cans and jars and
yeah,
wear masks forever
yeah,
in every way place, and it'll be a true eco dictatorship or something
yeah. Same with
enforced
20,
by the UN.
15-minute cities.
Yeah.
Same sort of fear mongering over that.
Well, right. Their fear mongering is like literally there's a different one every year, so
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
almost constant. With at least with progressives, it's every at least in the cycle because that's where it's like, well, a month ago this was making the rounds on social media in more left leaning spaces. Now every blue MAGA and Democrat is posting. I don't want to just say fear mongering, but I do classify it as that. But they're posting about the Project 2025 and how horrible it is. And no agreement, no disagreement for me. Of course, it's the Heritage Foundation's usual platform,
yeah,
and it becomes a platform. But the thing is, like 10 years ago, it was more about focusing on ALEC and your National Chamber of Commerce
yeah,
and how they're writing literally laws proposed on the state level. And so, in far as like right to work and the right wing agenda, especially the domestic capitalist agenda, to be class conscious about it, um, they, that's how there are lots of mechanisms that make that happen, or and movements that do either blunt it, block it, or they back up and take it off the table. Um, And so, especially with the last week, with Biden's being questioned as the prime candidate after his debate performance, which did we even talk about that on air yet? Maybe a little bit.
I think we must have.
Yeah, we
It
covered
must
it
have
last
happened
time.
since last time.
Um, it's been 3 weeks, I guess, but it's a lot. It's been a whirlwind, and of course, now that's off the table or whatever, and you have the moderate leadership or corporate leadership that were like kind of like maybe this isn't right, but it was the progressives in the squad that were like, but we have to show our loyalty. We always have to be loyal Dems,
Yeah,
so we have to actually back Biden. So progressives are actually like with sticking with Biden and like we need to keep Biden in there because they're just super afraid of losing any ground because they've obviously gained so much in the last cycle, sarcastically. And now it's like they're really just in a box. I'm like, I don't like what, well, I guess what their hope, their copium is that Biden, when he's now making public appearances to prove he's alive, or not dying, and he's projecting progressive platform. He even mentioned something that was a radical, like, anarchist project 12 years ago, which is the debt jubilee. You know, the public buying medical debt on private exchanges for pennies on the dollar and forgiving it, which I think was done by some, I don't know what state, but it was done on the state level a bit. Or no, maybe it was a locality. It was a municipal person
Yeah.
who made it a program. I think maybe it was a New England state
No, it could be.
that used $1 million out of in a line item to purchase medical debt and forgive it, because they know that it would have a stimulative effect.
Sure.
Which is, of course, the argument that occupiers have been making about debt and debt jubilee and how it rules their lives.
Yeah, force people to spend money on actual things. Yeah.
Yeah, but debt is what fuels the financial economy, right? And if we go into the long 20th century, we'll talk about that much further. But yeah, I wanted to make a TikTok about fear mongering, and how bad it is, and not that I don't know. I would say it was dangerous, because, you know, if someone was going to take a shot at Trump, they would have done so already. That's the kind of thinking I've had, you know. But then again, the fear mongering has not been as intense as it was this week. But doesn't that make it another layer of irony then, that the shooter was a projected groper?
Yeah, I just heard that too. I had not heard groper until just a few minutes before we started.
It was used in a post, so maybe his Discord account was actually dug up, and the FBI
That could be.
did find online stuff, and he was good at covering his tracks or something. Because otherwise, he was like not someone who was online a lot.
Yeah.
But the coder, he was a STEM nerd guy. Got his associate's degree, and there wasn't a consensus from his classmates, because you had one who would say he wasn't political outwardly, and another that's like, well, I took U.S. history with him, and when we would do like mock debate, or, you know, we would do our version of Jubilee Spectrum, where the teacher would ask us to stand on sides of the room to declare our position so we could talk about our positions. He would always take the conservative side no matter what, even if he was alone, meaning he was very invested.
Yeah.
But, you know, if he's in his own head enough, and he was a loner, as in super bullied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think no matter what, the conservatives will always spin it to the left did it. He was secretly Antifa. Like, even Candace Owen is like, oh, it's a little bit too perfect that he was so politically conservative. It's like they will take any amount of copium to make it the left.
And
side,
the left will always spin it to be something that was planned all along.
Yeah.
Which is equally stupid.
Yeah.
Though, okay, here's my take, and it feeds into the long 20th century. That the dichotomy of the long 20th century, sorry, not dichotomy, dialectic. Every era stage of capitalism has a dialectic. And the dialectic is market and plan, right? Our economy is as planned as it is market-based. We're always very confused, because we have equal parts of our society is things that are planned. We have a lot of things in our society that are planned. And we also have a lot of things in our society that are left to the anarchy of the market. And we really want it to be one thing or the other.
Mm.
Or we at least want to know which is which, but that takes some work. And you can spend a lot of your time as a nerd trying to distinguish which is which.
Mm-hmm.
And so one heuristic is simply to just assume or start from the position that everything that happens is something that is planned. Or you have to assume everything is just random chance and there's no rhyme or reason or societal or structural factors. So there's no structures, there's no society, there's no race or class or anything like that. That's where you get into just market and the super and cap libertarian thinking of like, wouldn't it be nice if everything was that arcane?
Yeah.
And that's how I think about everything. Or it's the opposite because they see everything as hostile, it must be planned. So something in common.
Yeah, that happens, yeah.
And of course, that's just as but I think it's being pointed out that it's mostly the blue MAGA who were chirping about the assassination attempt being staged.
Oh, I
Kind
have
of
no time for that sort of shit.
being very ahistorical, which when you're low consciousness, you got to be.
Mm-hmm.
That most American presidential assassinations have been off the cuff loner outlier people who just got were able to accomplish anything merely by chance.
Yeah.
And that the person who has assassinated the president or taken a shot, it was unplanned, it wasn't organized, it was usually just some random man who was aggrieved.
Yeah.
Even the bomb wielding anarchists, they were targeting the rich, actually, not presidents. Though there was the one, I think, Garfield was shot by an anarchist. So that was the highest up anarchist violence got. And that was, again, not organized, just a random guy who shot him at Niagara Falls. And that's, but it led to Teddy Roosevelt being president, which was pretty good as far as breaking the trust goes.
Mm-hmm.
Were very unpopular and bad for international capital. Trust, that is, as well as working people. But it's funny how things align, right?
It is funny.
But always that there's also the dialectic between domestic capital and international capital, and that's what sort of comes through in like the kind of posts. It's a post I'm kind of annoyed with, which is, we're not talking about this, but we should, or there's this, but people don't want to have that conversation.
I hate that. Yeah.
My version of it, though, that if I were to make such a post, and maybe I'll make a certain version, is that we're not talking about how that between basically the Victorian era in American history, meaning between Civil War and World War I, is very undercovered. Because there's no major wars and there's no major events. It's really a long kind of churn. Like, you can talk about certain developments, robber barons, maybe labor movement, maybe this or that, maybe the Cuban-American War, the Spanish-American War. So that's a war. Remember the Maine. So these are the factoids. It's part of everyone's consciousness. But then there's a ton of stuff that isn't, but should be. Because it's actually the formation of our current system. And the context of that formation is actually that between 1873 and 1896 was a 3-decade global depression. And we're never taught to know that, to think of it that way. Those 30 years was a global depression. Now, we think of it as we're up and coming, and our industry is expanding. It's our era of industrialization,
the
right?
Golden Age, yeah.
But it was in response to the downturn in the global economy led by Great Britain, because their system is a free trade imperialism. It's free trade, and it was the progressive era and the trusts was all a response by capital in America to free trade, to be anti-free trade, to work to suspend the free market, not the free market, but free trade, but yeah, the free market, and in our own way, which is basically through tariffs and protectionism. And the further beyond Great Britain's signal crisis, when their economy switched to financialization after our Civil War in 1873, they switched to a heavily financialized economy like ours is today. And there's really no way they could change how things were going. They could not do anything to stop the rash of protectionism in their competitors, basically, particularly America and Germany. And the more people were protectivist, the more their system broke down. And that's really, like, that's not discussed as a cause of World War I, but it fucking should be. Because that's the materialist answer to the question. It's not, an entanglement of alliances. That's just the political surface.
Right, yeah.
What's the money doing?
You're right.
Because
that is never discussed.
And the reason there was such optimism between 1900 and 1914 that everything's going great and why is everyone riding so high? It's because the UK depression has ended and they're having a great time. And there's always these great moments during these financialized stages of a accumulation regime, like the UK's. And so when in the 90s, that was our great moment, where things are in a downturn. We're really in a long depression, but thanks to some Keynesianism, it isn't so bad. And that's the point of government like Keynesianism, which is that it still goes up and down, but not as up and down as it did when it was Great Britain.
Throttles
and it got really bad.
Yeah.
And so the depravities of the Victorian era are kind of interlaced with that. So going through the last 100 pages of the book, Long 20th Century, it's been very elucidating. Going through all of that, because he has to go through all of the contradictions with the British system in order to explain our system.
Sure.
And then the last 30 pages I'm going through is the contradictions in our system, which you can get a good sense of if you listen to Democracy Now! Or have watched the series by Oliver Stone, U.S. is American History Uncensored or whatever it's called.
Oh, okay.
He mostly focuses on American imperialism and how our system, our global hegemony, is made up of three parts. One is the multinational corporation. One is our military Keynesianism, or the military-industrial complex, I guess, or our power projection. Military supremacy. Our military supremacy is one. What was number two? Oh yeah, our monetary dominance as well. The importance of the dollar. And the contradictions are in that these three elements are both supporting each other, but also undermining each other all the time. You can't really have it all, because the better the dollar's doing, the more multinationals are going to ship capital out of our country, right? The less protectionist we can be. The more military supremacy we have, the more that multinationals can develop overseas, and the more they develop overseas, the weaker it makes the dollar. The weaker the dollar is, the more we have to expend on the military, the more corporations are wagging the dog. And we see that in our lifetimes, where we really can't quite make. Sometimes we're kind of confused, but also kind of drawing conclusions about what comes first: the multinational corporation, the war on terror, and the incidents that become the opportunities, like 9/11, or 20-year-old take shot at Trump. Change history. It's like, and it also annoys me to say a future textbook will have this picture. Fuck off. If I have anything to say about curriculum, in 30 years, if I have anything to say about New York State history curriculum, we're not going to give a shit about presidents, and we're definitely not going to give a shit about Trump.
Well, yeah.
it's got to be more materialist than that. And our history right now is one of hitting the limit of profitability. Although at the same time we're not, right. Corporations are profits have never been higher, right. And it shows that their profitability is not really predicated on production and trade, but just how much money's moving around, and so on.
Yeah.
And but that will hit a limit, and then capital will need to reinvest in production again, and I guess we'll have good times and America will be great again, but for maybe 20 years, right? But the thing is, we only were great for the 20 years or 25 years between 1948 and 72 because of military Keynesianism. The already makes the case that it was the Truman administration that was taking the initiative and starting that chain reaction of investment in production. It was not the capitalists, multinationals. They were following U.S. policy because it was Truman and the Marshall Plan, and then followed by, and their plan was to triple the Pentagon budget. But they were thinking to themselves, how are we going to make that case to a Congress that really does not want to spend more on the military?
Mm-hmm.
Then the Korean War starts. But are you going to tell me that then leftists need to conclude that Kim Il-sung was in on it or something? Because they saved American capitalism, that, you know, it fed into the plans of Truman?
Yeah, I think him being a convenient scapegoat and communism being a convenient scapegoat, little simpler explanation.
Well, here's the thing. So they sold the Marshall Plan with fear of communism, but but they were thinking that tripling the Pentagon budget, like they really can't go so far. Like there's only so much they can milk the fear wagon of anti-capitalist communism when it comes to the American capitalists, especially the international ones. Because throughout, something to go backwards, like Wall Street doesn't like tariffs because in the past, their fortunes were tied to London and the free trade system. And ours is a free enterprise, you know, multinational corporation system. But again, it's not the domestic sector. I mean, the domestic sector was tied to it so long as we were exporting, as long as it was production that was getting invested in. That stopped after 72, and they've never they've had a bee in their bonnet, not bee up their asshole ever since. And that's sort of where you get, and this I haven't heard all the conversations yet, but like the Teamsters president spoke at the RNC last night. He was the keynote speaker, and as long as he coached it in nationalist terms, he could say all the pro-labor, borderline socialist policy he wanted, as long as he coached it in terms of nationalism.
Right.
Now, this is kind of dangerous because that is national socialism.
Yeah, right.
To be trite with it, because that's not what it really is. Because the thing about National Socialism / the German mode version of corporatism was that their corporatism was horizontal. You had firms and trusts that went across industries and sectors, and American corporatism is vertical, as you may have learned about vertical integration with Standard Oil, and Carnegie was the first to pioneer this, and that's why we have public library system, because Carnegie was so fucking rich he could just buy every little town a library. We paid for the buildings anyway. It was up to the towns to maintain. But it was, but yeah, it's fun. It's fun. You can still teach the old version of like, here's some cool people history, but put them in the context.
Oh, for sure.
And yeah, so why don't we go to the 20th century video?
Oh yeah, all right.
20th century.
So this one is
we have enough.
Andrewism. That's the channel. On left
No, no,
is
no, 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 no.
no.
We're going down. We're going down the list.
Oh, I only see
The
the.
long 20th century.
Oh, my mistake. My mistake.
Isn't the playlist there?
Let's find it. I'm sure it's in here somewhere.
Yeah, scroll down to the bottom.
Yeah.
The long 20th century.
Long
Second to the top.
20th century. Gotcha. Here we go.
So this is made by a random guy. He's
This
not a great
presentation-
presenter, but you know, it exists. He made it. So I guess I'm gonna
Jeff
have to
Cakes.
just kind of make my own. I've already kind of written an outline for a book talk, so I think I may do the same. I will
Very
not
cool.
be quoting from the book like he does because it's a very dense, overly kind of overly written book. There's definitely like I almost want to rewrite this book, make it like 100 pages or 150, and use plainer language. Because you absolutely like when I'm reading it, I'm trying to translate it in my head.
Sure.
Because he's using not when I say overwritten, I mean he just uses a lot of words because he's being precise, and he's saying like he's not using any shorthand when he says, you know, when he's explaining what America is. Not just saying it's a republic. It's like no, it's this that. You know, when it takes 4 words. Almost like corporate speak, I guess.
Sure.
All right, let's get going.
Yeah, let's take a look.
And I'll pop.
Is a review of The Long 20th Century, Money, Power, and the Origins of Our Times by Devin E. This book details the history of capitalism from its early beginnings in Italy during the 14th century to the United States' capitalist hegemony in the 20th century. Arrighi examines the changing fortunes of Venetian, Genoese, Dutch, British, and finally the United States. His analysis compares 4 long centuries of systemic cycles of capital accumulation that led to the ascendancy of the Dutch, British, and United States superpowers. Arrighi focuses specifically on how the maturity and eventual decline of these cycles of capital accumulation in every major development of the capitalist world is heralded by a particular switch from trade in commodities to trade in money.
Pause.
First is
So the main thesis of the book that he takes like 600 pages to explain, but that's sort of the fun of it, is that
the Genoese cycle.
That our recent stage of capitalism that is financialized since 1972 is not like some people will say because of the expansion of like money flowing around and all, it's a revolution, right? Everything like there's sort of a tendency to treat everything that happens as being new, and it's never happened like this before. But actually, it, of course, like, you know, history is a spiral upward.
Sure.
But it has this switch to financialization is actually a reoccurring pattern in capitalism. So I find that to be something of a comfort, actually. You know, because like this whole like we're an unknown. There's always this like anxiety because we're in unknown territory, and like we have no idea what's going to happen. Because nothing like this has happened before.
Yeah.
And the technologies we're using. But though, of course, the technologies and the lifespan and our standard of living has changed and gotten better, the patterns of capital and what it does has always like not always the same, but it changes in these patterns, and the amount of time it takes between switches is shorter, and so it's like that kind of there's a hopium to it that we can just not we can ride the waves,
Yeah.
so to speak. Yeah. Okay. Oh yeah, and this will if he doesn't show this again, that with each system of cycle, that there's an adding of integrating of costs. So at the bottom, you see he circles Genoese, and they did not cover any of these kinds of costs. But the Dutch incorporated protection costs. The British incorporated production costs, so it becomes a mode of production. And then the U.S. incorporates transaction costs, which think of when we talk of the economies of speed, not just economies of scale, but economies of speed. that within a corporation, you've basically lowered your transaction costs between your subsidiaries and you and your suppliers and your distributors. If it's all under one roof, your transaction costs are now 0 or minimal. That's really efficient. And it's one of those things where, like, well, actually, big corporations are kind of good in some ways. It's not the organizations that are bad, it's that it's capitalist and the purpose of it. Because you can make the case that, like Network does, and he does play Network at the end of this, that the Soviet Union was just like a big corporation.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Keep playing it, I'm going to go get more water.
Sure. All right. Continue now.
From the 15th to the early 17th centuries. Second is the Dutch cycle from the late 16th century through most of the 18th. Third is the British cycle from the latter half of the 18th century through the early 20th century. And fourth is the US cycle, which began in the late 19th century and has continued into the current phase of financial expansion that Arrighi refers to as the long 20th century. Arrighi based the interpretive scheme of this book on the work of Fernand Braudel, who argued that finance capital is not a particular stage of world capitalism, let alone its latest and highest stage. Rather, it is a recurrent phenomenon which has marked the capitalist era from its early beginnings in late medieval and early modern Europe. Arrighi concludes the book by examining the hegemonic forces that have shaped and could now possibly undermine the U.S. empire's long 20th century. Defining capitalism. Arrighi defines capitalism as something born out of and historically contingent upon an older world market economy. Arrighi asserts that capitalism grew out of the conflict between many previous war-making power struggles for territory and population control, and the many state-making trade relationships developing between different world markets.
Point.
For Arrighi, this book is not meant to explain the origins of this world.
So he doesn't go into the details, but that little line there about, like, the territorialist wars, he's referring to the 100 Years' War between England and France.
Sure.
And then all of the Italian wars, and there were all these wars between the Italian city-states. So it was in these wars that you had a commercialization of warfare, moving away from just having peasant levy armies, but more mercenaries, more professional armies, more standing armies you pay wages, and thus you need to have currency to pay them with. And that means you need to be making money, as if you're a monarchy, but particularly if you're any kind of state. So that war, he always kind of uses the phrase of war and state making as one thing, because they are the one thing, war and state making. But obviously these are two different. You can make war, and you can also produce a state, but they kind of go together.
They kind of feed into each other.
Right.
Market economy that was already the underlying structure of material life long before capitalism arose as a world system. Instead, this book is meant to explain how capitalism rose above the structures of the pre-existing world market economy and, over time, acquired its power to reshape the markets and lives of the entire world. Arrighi views capitalism as a multi-tiered structure.
Markets are not capitalism. Markets are not capitalism.
Very important, yeah.
And
Markets
it's a
have been
mistake a lot of us leftists make. We want to argue against markets, and we can, but that is separate from arguing against capitalism. Because there are a lot of people that are like okay with markets because of what they do, and that's something you can say, yeah, those have always been around.
Yeah.
And we've always had merchants and capitalists.
Sure.
But they haven't been in charge of the government, right? In Rome, rich merchants were not senators. It was only in Venice, Milan, Florence, and Genoa that you had the merchant class become the government, wrestle things away from aristocrats and nobles who were sort of acting like merchants, but not doing a good job of it.
Yeah, good thing to point out.
Which, as in all hierarchies, the upper layer could not exist without the lower stages on which they depend. In this book, Arrighi focuses specifically on the upper layer of capital accumulation in the capitalist hierarchy, and how that accumulation has unfolded in each long century that has produced a new world power that secured
Pause there.
control over an expanding world.
I don't think he shows this again. This is a really cool. I made one, but it was on a flash drive I misplaced, so I may have to make it again. But I've made a spiffier version of this timeline of these long centuries, and how you can notice they're overlapping.
Yeah.
And that you can kind of divide them into thirds, where 1/3 is where a system is developing in the shadow of the current one. Then it becomes the current system after a terminal crisis of the last system. Then it has its signal crisis. And while it's, it has a signal crisis. And then the next system starts developing in its part 3. So every long century has 3 parts, and one system's first part will be the last one's third part.
Yeah. Interesting how the time scale gets compressed with each succession too. So.
Yeah, it's gonna get shorter and shorter. If there's a long 21st century, though, with the way. Yeah, a long 21st century.
Yeah,
I mean,
will
it end before the 22nd century, or like exactly? So like, and you can kind of like project, and all the anxiety about China and authoritarian regimes is really just this trying to grapple with this foreboding or the kind of what's the phrase? Not the giving up, but not wanting to give it up, but that there is an inevitability.
The resignation, maybe.
Resignation, as some Democrats are doing right now about Trump.
Yeah.
The resignation of the inevitability that yes, we're in our third part, and East Asia is in their first part.
Yeah.
And these authoritarian regimes are simply the next stage of capitalism. But their stage will be more like a world market again, since their upper classes, their ruling classes, are not so much hard. They're not bankers.
That's true. Yeah, they're not their millionaires and billionaires. That's true.
They're bureaucrats, and they are like a corporation.
Yeah.
But there's different goals there. The goal is maybe just develop the national economy, but there is also an internationalism there, a one worldism.
Yeah.
That was only able to be practiced in bits. Like the FDR and his ilk's plans for the post-war world was to remake the whole world in America's image. By that meaning the New Deal. Okay, New Deal for the world. Obviously, he died, and Truman and more international capital had their own plans, which was that's a lot of money that we don't want to spend, so we'll remake the world in America's image, but only a bit at a time. We'll start with Europe and Turkey and Japan with the Marshall Plan. Then we'll do it a little bit more every decade. We do it a little bit more. We make the world in our image. But of course, while we're doing that, everything else is developing. But now it seems like, but it's almost like once that goal is almost complete, as soon as the whole world is remade in our image, that will be the trigger for the end of the American hegemony. Because now everyone is actually equal to us. Right? They have multinationals. They have their own developed economies. And it'll be fun. It's fun to think of it that way, because it's a way of looking at the future that isn't apocalyptic or dystopian.
True.
I think it's a by nowhere a utopian. Nowhere it is in fact a place, but it's a place that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah.
But it's visible all around us if we look at how, half of the world's black pepper is grown in Vietnam.
Wow.
Yeah. Maybe it's a third, but that's still a lot for one country. And and just how much Indonesia and Brazil, and then the BRICS, but of course it's way more than the BRICS now. That's so 15 years ago. Just saying BRICS. That's now there's another whole 15 more nations that can
Right.
basically be counted on as just as important as everyone else.
Indeed. All right, let's move on.
World economic space. However, Arrighi admits that this book is not meant to reconstruct capitalism's entire history as a world economic force. Instead, Arrighi has directed this book primarily on the history of the top layer of capital accumulation in the capitalist hierarchy, because as Arrighi humbly states, we cannot do everything at once. Territorialism versus capitalism. Throughout the book, Arrighi interweaves the analysis of two major forms of world power that eventually formed modern capitalism. The first is territorialism, which perceives territorial expansion as central to its expanding military and state power over land and populations, with capital as a means to expand more territorially. And second, capitalism, which considers territorial expansion primarily as a possible instrument for more capital accumulation. As Arrighi explains, in the territorialist strategy, controls over territory and population is the objective, and control over mobile capital the means of state and war-making. In the capitalist strategy, the relationship is turned upside down. Control over mobile capital is the objective, and control over territory and population the means. The origins of capital accumulation. Arrighi details how the formation and expansion of the Dutch, British, and United States capitalist hegemons were modeled on the developing interstate system of commerce first established by Italian city-states in the 14th century. However, each of the three hegemons held a different balance of power between their capitalist and territorialist logics in the interstate system of commercial exchange. As Arrighi explains, the critical feature of this interstate system has been the constant opposition of the capitalist and territorialist logics of power and the recurrent resolution of their contradictions through the reorganization of world political economic space by the leading state of the epoch.
So this sort of needs a translation, right? Would you say? So the translation is that you have kingdoms who want to conquer more land and nobles who want more land, because more land means more peasants, and that means, more stuff. And you have capitalist logics where I can just trade more along the trade circuits that have been opened up by the Mongols along the Silk Road, and I can make a lot of money that way. And that if we just build, Venice, we could build more ships, and then we can control the sea lanes along the Mediterranean, and that is, we can make just as much money and bring in more stuff as if we just conquered more land, which we're not going to be able to do, or we don't need to do. Especially as a republic, when you're a merchant republic, or at least a city state in particular. So even before they're merchant republics, they're just city states with nobles themselves, nobility. But yeah, the territorialists. But when he mentions the Genoese system, there was sort of a partnership between the two with the Iberians. So, and Venice didn't. So that's kind of how they declined in power, so to speak. But he also kind of makes the distinction that the Venice was like a state capitalist economy, kind of like China, where you had the state was like a big business. Why? Because the main merchant families were the government. They were one and the same. So that's truly state capitalist. So it's actually kind of an argument to say that the CCP is not state capitalism, because though you do have capitalists who are party members, they're more sublated to them, or at least
Subordinated.
subs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Subordinated. So let's see. In the recurrent resolution of their contradictions through the reorganization. So, yeah, just saying that like these two things are forces that are sort of butting heads sometimes, but also working together, or like they're dialectic.
Mm-hmm.
And it resolves in the form of colonialism.
Very interesting.
This 14th century world interstate system of commerce and trade and the subsystem of Italian city-states preconfigured some main features of the modern capitalist world. For instance, the invention of high finance, the protection-producing industry of war-making and state-making, including a self-perpetuating system of commercialized violence that Arrighi calls military Keynesianism,
This is
and
the
the
wrong
extensive
B-roll.
networks of
But this is the wrong B-roll. Like, it's some kind of history of the northern Italian city-states. So it's like you're showing French, and he's showing a timeline that goes into the 19th century. But essentially, military protecting producing industry refers to like Venice and their big armories, like they had their ship-making facilities and all that. And military Keynesianism, also like you had Venice and Milan they had state-owned military factories to arm their, to make their arm, to equip their armies. And this created, a boom economy or a production boom. And then residential diplomacy being that last part I just interrupted, which is that they were Machiavelli paving the way. Was, you had these professional diplomats that you would station in every court, and they were your eyes and ears, and they gave you a massive advantage that no one else would have by establishing embassies and resident diplomats, like Machiavelli was in the Vatican. And then he picked up, and he was basically writing his theory. His political theory was based on his experiences at the cutting edge of the formation of capitalism.
Interesting. Although I don't
Yeah.
know a whole lot about Machiavelli, but I do
I know
seem to
that.
recall that he was very much against mercenaries and mercenary armies because he
Yeah.
thought they would not be loyal to whatever city-state that they
The
would be
city-state, yeah.
employed from.
Citizens make better fighters. They have a skin in the game, as it were.
Yeah.
They can be well trained. Yeah, and especially since, like, it was a political position as
Mhm.
well as just
Yeah, it's kind of
is
a
it good
nationalistic
policy or not?
position
Yeah, it had. So just keep in mind that there's kind of multiple, like, people, authors and historical figures have multiple phases in their life.
Sure.
And they hold different jobs and working for different people. And something that is that when he was writing The Prince, he's writing for the audience that is the Medicis, and he sort of works for them, but he also doesn't. He actually wants a job with them, and he's writing this book to gain favor with them.
I see.
But yes, he was a Republican, and thus the Medicis were his enemy and exiled him, which is when he wrote his discourses on Livy, which is, you should actually, if you want to know, and it is included in the compendium of modern political thought, that's what you should start with. Don't forget The Prince. I mean, The Prince is good, but the discourses on Livy is more important, because it's like the rule of actually read whatever historical figure, just look at the last thing they were doing. That's where they're like, what are they really about?
They really got their shit together.
What are they
by then.
doing when
Yeah.
they're free of other obligations, like
Sure,
when they're in
sure.
retirement, in this case exile? He's writing from the heart, and his heart is Republican, because in the discourses on Livy, Livy, a Roman writer, he's writing his response. His commentary on that is, isn't a multi-branch government great? We should really have that. We should have an executive branch, an independent judiciary, and an assembly that represents the people and citizens, however you define citizens. Whether they be landowners at the time or just anyone who lives in the city. Men, but you get my gist.
Yeah.
And reading that, and I read both, and the assignment was to do a kind of a compare and contrast. And in doing so, I also needed to read about his actual life and his career was as a diplomat, so he's overseeing as well as doing some of the cloak and dagger and the espionage and the things that he's writing about in the prints, like how to do things, or it's a guidebook, but it's more like just a list of advice about good governance. And it's always misinterpreted because people just love a pithy quote of "it's better to be loved than feared," except it's preceded by a paragraph about like how that quote that's a conclusion of lesser evil. That it's like in all else fails, right? If all else fails, it's better to be feared than loved. But that's only if you're in a very particular situation.
You have to force a
and
certain
and he's
outcome.
clear that it will only work in the short term.
Yeah, that context is kind of lost with the people.
Yes, it is.
Like that.
And that's in the prints, so you don't have to read the other stuff too. You can just read the prints and understand that it isn't just be evil, be a dirtbag.
Yeah, everything is
for the sake of power.
Ends always justify the means. Yeah.
Yeah, ends always justify the means.
Yeah.
Well, in his maybe it's kind of true, but his ends is a Republican government and his means is statecraft. And the prince is about statecraft, and we're getting off tangent, but hey, this is a good history lesson. It's college level history. It's way better than high school history. You actually learn it, and you go beyond just fucking dumbass tech books with potential pictures of just Trump raising his fist, which is just so fucking hilarious to me that he's throwing up the leftist power sign.
I know that was
what else could
bizarre to me too.
But what else could he do, right? Could he?
I mean, you could have done that.
Could he? What kind of not a peace sign?
Yeah,
what else could
they don't have a lot of forceful gestures that aren't overtly fascist anymore, huh?
Right. So he does the leftist one, and it's like, is anyone gonna say, "Oh, Trump is actually a secret leftist"? He does the Black Power fist.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
I mean, you never know with some of the crazy conspiracies that have been coming out.
I'm glad it was finally clarified, though, because it just seemed to be going back and forth that it was the bullet that nicked his ear.
There's no way it could have been the teleprompter. It was on the other side.
The teleprompters were undamaged, actually. So
not to mention that
they weren't a factor at all.
He was turned. His ear was covered. It was not a.
But that's interesting about someone. It was Kyle Kalinske I was watching that was reviewing his post right afterwards, where he's not like it's not full come to Jesus, but he was like kind of introspective. He was like, the right thing to do for me is to actually tone it down and tell all the other Republicans to tone it down, which is the best possible fucking thing they could do. I mean, the worst thing for the Democrats is if they actually tone it down, which is kind of funny and hilarious and ironic. So it's like, all he has to do is tone it down a little, and now the Democrats are actually the crazy ones. And the whole like constant memeing about, the Republicans are dying, they're toast, they're over. I'm like, do you know fucking anything about American history? All they have to do is change their messaging a little bit, and they're back in business.
Yeah.
And all those independent voters will be eating out of their fucking hand.
Oh, absolutely.
All they need is a little fucking real populism, which, yes, till last week was all just anti-immigration. Mm-hmm. But for the older generation, it fucking works. Like, my mother was actually kind of buying it slightly. But only like as a hypothetical almost. Like, well, what's he, he doesn't, isn't that a point? Doesn't he have a point there? There has been a lot of job loss. Like, yeah, but that's because neither party can really do anything about that because it's capitalism.
Yeah. Yeah. The corporations have decided that they're just going to make as much money as they can, and they have the perfect scapegoat in inflation and pinning it on whatever president's in power. But
and they make money with money, not building housing.
Right, yeah, by convincing investors that they're growing.
And when they build housing,
X%,
the purpose is to speculate on it.
Yeah.
The profit is coming from speculation.
Speculation
now,
is always the point.
That can slow down, but that's when we'll really have problems. And so,
stay tuned. Yeah.
And yeah, stay tuned.
Residential diplomacy meant for managing trade-related information gathering and balancing the struggle between differing territorialist and capitalist powers. This early residential diplomacy among early Italian city-states was centered mostly in Venice, Florence, Genoa, and Milan. And while all these Italian city-states played a significant role in capitalism's early emergence, as Arrighi highlights, Venice is the true prototype of the capitalist state. The residential diplomacy developed between these city-states in Italy tipped the balance of world economic power toward a more capitalist approach over a more territorialist approach. By 1420, these Italian city-states had revenues that were comparable to the dynastic feudal states of Spain and Portugal. As Arrighi highlights, these Italian city-states thereby showed that even small territories could become huge containers of power by pursuing one-sidedly the accumulation of riches rather than the acquisition of territories and subjects. The first Genoese cycle of capital accumulation. This early capitalist approach in Italy led to the first significant cycle of capital accumulation in the city-state of Genoa that tightened the dominance of capital over the enlarged world economy through complex systems of high finance. However, the technical virtuosity on the part of the Genoese merchant bankers was not enough to completely overthrow the medieval system of rule on a worldwide scale. One major reason, according to Arrighi, is that the Genoese merchant bankers had never been self-sufficient in organizing the protection needed by its long-distance traffics. This created high protection costs.
You don't really know Genoa as being a military power.
Yeah, that's not something that
Right. They
we tend to
didn't
learn about.
spend any money on that. They partnered with the Iberians, Spain and Portugal, to protect their trade lanes.
Sure.
Which of course they were always kind of sucky at, but they did conquer a large portion of the world. But the thing that distinguished, like when you see any depictions, like in say Shogun, that when Portugal and Spain are going out, they're going out for God. Like when they want to make money, they're making money or doing wheeling and dealing to spread the word of God.
Sure.
And to change leaders to make every nation Christian or Catholic, but you get it. They're not really in it for the money. The money's just the means. So they partnered with the Genoese, and all of that American silver, that American silver is coming in, and it was coming through the hands of the Genoese bankers.
Mm-hmm.
So when that line of like how do they control finance in Europe? Well, all of this wealth coming in from the Americas through the Iberian empires, they basically had a monopoly of controlling that, like laundering that silver into other currency. It destroyed all other mining in Europe because there was a silver mining in Germany. But with all of that Mexican silver coming in, that was destroyed.
Oh.
Right? No, like they couldn't compete, obviously.
Yeah.
There was this flood of almost free silver coming in, and it destroyed local economies in Europe. And the Ottoman Empire caused massive inflation. And eventually it flowed through the whole Silk Road circuit from India to China, and it blew up their economies, that silver. It's sort of why, like, there was a century where China was kind of being really expansionist. They were building canals. They were sending out their treasure fleet, and they were kind of they were expanding their tributary system to eventually the goal was to even include East Africa in their tributary system, and eventually it would include Arabia and then Egypt if they kept going. But again, that was if they sent out more treasure fleets out. But they could only afford the one, because then the Mexican silver came in, and wide inflation, economic crash. We got to look inward again and just maintain. So that's why that whole those books I foolishly bought one of those books where it's like the year China discovered America. Have you heard of those?
I
I guess not.
No, I don't think I have.
There's this pseudo archaeologist who pontificates about it's almost an ancient aliens type of science,
Oh,
where he just extrapolates how China not only discovered the Americas before the Europeans did, but settled there. And there were Chinese colonies in Latin America because he found like a headstone with Chinese script on it or something. And then these mounds in the Caribbean that are obvious evidence, clear
mounds,
evidence of beached Chinese ships that tried to repair there after crossing the Atlantic from Africa, and just saying that they could have kept going from East Africa around the Cape to West Africa. I'm like, but there's no evidence of that, and it's just like after a third or a half in, I'm like, wait a minute, he's not citing any evidence for any of this. He's just
wild
speculating.
speculation.
And I'm like, and then I just put the fucking thing down and gave it away, and I'm like, not touching this ever.
Yeah.
Because I think because then I did I looked up the wiki article. I'm like, is there criticism of this? Because this seems really off. And yeah, it was just like, yeah, the guy's a quack. Okay.
That's funny.
Over.
The Genoese financiers, who were always plagued with violent domestic competitive struggles and endless feuds that eventually forced them to buy outside protection from the Iberian territorialist rulers of Spain and Portugal, which significantly undermined their profiteering schemes. In other words, the very logic of profit-making restrained the self-expansion of Genoese capital and thereby threatened it with self-destruction. It wouldn't be until the rise of the Dutch republics in the late 16th century before a new kind of capitalist state, the United Provinces, would be presented with and seize the opportunity to transform the European system of rule to the requirements of the accumulation of capital on a world scale.
Now this is because he skips over it, but Antwerp was part of that cycle of silver being converted into local currency and stuff, because Antwerp was like the main port that a lot of the German economies were flowing out of. And that the Benelux states are also just a bunch of, like, the United Provinces were just a bunch of city-states that became a nation-state. So that climbing the ladder from city-state, nation-state, world-state.
Interesting.
The Dutch hegemony and the second cycle of capital accumulation. The second cycle of capital accumulation started in the late 16th century and was dominated by the United Provinces, who were a collection of Dutch republics that revolted against feudalism. As Auriga explains, these Dutch republics became hegemonic by leading a large and powerful coalition of dynastic states toward the liquidation of the medieval system of rule. Auriga details that this liquidation of the European feudal system by the United...
just that bad. The 30 Years' War was just that bad. That it was such chaos, so unable to do any trade, that the dynastic, territorial kingdoms were like, we'll accept a new system. We will sign the Peace of Westphalia. Which, in one way, it's put in one like historical podcast or whatever, was like, a local lord will now have the same diplomatic standing as a king or an emperor. Because part of the chaos of this 30 Years' War was you had different layers of feudalism fighting with each other, and you always had your lord above you who would do treaties for you, or you'd have to defer to the emperor.
Sure.
If you were a German prince. Well, now you have all these different German princes fighting each other over who's Protestant and who's not. And it's getting hot. It's too hot. And eventually, the only way you could solve it is everyone has to be the same diplomatically as a nation state. No longer feudal, because you didn't even have states. You just had families with territory. But now you had nation states that happened to be headed by families, but still
a little different.
That was the transition. Eventually, it's doesn't matter who's king.
Okay.
United Provinces led to the first world interstate system established by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This new Westphalia interstate system of commerce established state sovereignty that rests on international law and the balance of power, a law operating between rather than above states, and a power operating between rather than above states. Arrighi argues this reorganization of worldwide political and economic space, marked by the Westphalia system's establishment, is the historical birth of the capitalist state and became dominated by a Dutch capitalist oligarchy that utilized similar high finance tactics used by the Genoese, however with some key differences. According to Arrighi, the Dutch capitalist oligarchy did more than just lead the world in capital accumulation. They also reintroduced the standardized approach to military tactics once seen in the Roman Empire. Marching, loading, and firing guns became a regular practice in the Dutch republics and was a critical innovation that neutralized the large-scale advantages of war-making once dominated by Spain and Portugal. This localized militaristic approach by the Dutch created an internalization of protection costs for the Dutch capitalist oligarchy and turned protection costs into revenues.
Meaning,
however,
wars
this Dutch
could
way
pay
of
for
making
themselves.
Wars could what?
Wars could pay for themselves, which wasn't usually the case in the past. Like, you really had to go for broke if you're war making, you know. But sometimes they wouldn't pay; they would backfire. Like in the 100 Years' War, a lot of those campaigns by English kings was to just pay off the debts from the last war, or to help British manufacturing of cloth, but it would backfire. So, and that's why eventually England does lose that conflict. But it was only really 100 years because you had the plagues breaking everything up. Like, you know, you had to set things aside for a bit before you could go campaigning again.
Yeah, makes sense.
Wars pay for themselves inspired other European states like France and England to do the same, and ironically, began undermining the hegemony of the Dutch capitalist oligarchy almost as soon as it began. British hegemony and free trade imperialism. In 1652, only 4 years after implementing the Westphalia interstate system, the hegemony of the Dutch began to be challenged by England in the Anglo-Dutch War, and then by France in the Franco-Dutch War beginning in 1672. According to Arrighi, by the 18th century, the global power struggle set in motion by the West.
He skips this, but like it makes it sound like, you know, they were already being beaten back. The Dutch won those wars, but it was just a signal that like they're competing with each other. That the Netherlands are never truly dominant, except in finance, but and the territorialist states or monarchies aren't really able to compete with them yet. But through mercantilism, they develop until they do.
The Westphalia interstate system had enabled a new synthesis of the capitalist state called mercantilism, dominated by France and England. This new mercantilist approach relied on three interrelated components: settler colonialism, capitalist slavery, and economic nationalism. The success of settler colonialism by European nations eventually...
Because I just want to explain what is meant by economic nationalism. That beforehand, you had all of the European merchants. You were like a merchant financier. You were going to Antwerp to do business with their trading. But it was during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I that there was a merchant, an English merchant, that's like, we need to start our own trading house here in London. And then become and it was, you know, founded by the Queen, the Royal Exchange, which still stands today. And so it's meant by like English merchants are making money for the sake of England, and so those revenues are being circulated and used and integrated into the English state for, you know, for war and state making. English merchants fund the English Navy, which then also, like the Dutch, has internalized their protection costs to protect their trade and fight for colonies and settle colonies, which eventually are too scarce in labor, so then they need to turn to West African slavery. And by the way, that trade triangle is developed by the Dutch, right? The Atlantic Trade Triangle. Maybe you remember that from your history book.
Yes,
In
yeah.
middle school. That's developed by the Dutch and the Dutch companies, which then kind of get superseded by the English and the French. Anyway, he doesn't go too far into it. Don't need to do that.
Set in motion the world hegemony of the British, but it also created shortages of labor power which could not be satisfied by relying exclusively, or even primarily, on the supplies engendered spontaneously from within the ranks of settler populations or extracted forcibly from indigenous populations. So the European solution to settler colonial labor shortages was to secure slave labor primarily from Africa to maintain capitalist enterprises' profitability. Settler colonialism and capitalist slavery were necessary but still insufficient conditions for the mercantilist success of England and France. The missing ingredient was an internalization of production costs by what Arrighi calls economic nationalism. Economic nationalism combines the pursuit of endless capital accumulation and interstate commerce with state and war making directed toward national economy making. Economic nationalism was able to internalize production costs by reallocating increased tax revenues derived from the benefits of world commerce, of settler colonialism, and of capitalist slavery, and turn these benefits into adequate rewards for entrepreneurship and productive efforts of their metropolitan subjects.
Pause.
According to Arrighi, economic nationalism.
So my translation of that is that internalization of production costs is to say that English colonies are going to export to English manufacturing, and English manufacturing can then export again to its subjects or for its domestic market. The triangle of trade, as it were. But just the point there that it's English colonies. So, like, you had Dutch colonies, but they were actually the companies. It was corporations doing that. So the Dutch hegemony was also a kind of corporate with the joint stock companies. They had their own military, security forces, and they did all kinds of terrible things to gain monopolies of trade in the Indian Ocean and Indonesia, or spice trade and whatever. And but that's the Dutch system that the English are growing into, So it's interesting that Caitlin and other smarter, or rather conservatives that can read, will want to do this course for translating socialism, and it's like whenever a leftist mentions any of these things, basically settler colonialism, slavery, and so on, it's like it all means capitalism. Now,
yeah,
it's really reductive. These are all elements of capitalism,
right?
But that's something that also isn't elucidated enough, because I guess maybe it's just assumed that these are all parts of capitalism that are part of its development, particularly this stage of capitalism, the colonialist stage.
Yeah.
With the British being the imperialist stage, and ours being the corporatist stage. So whether it's corporate capitalism or corporate communism, as a Fox News pundit called it, it is all corporatism. And and we don't have a name for what's next, but when whatever you call it, late capitalism or late stage capitalism, it's just the financialized stage of corporatism.
Sure.
We're still in the same stage as Americans as we were with Carnegie and Rockefeller, which is why all of the buildings still have their names on them.
Hey, yeah, it's not a coincidence.
We'll know we're in the next stage when those names change.
Yeah, right.
Entrepreneurship and productive efforts of their metropolitan subjects. According to Arrighi, economic nationalism created new incentives and opportunities to establish ever new linkages between activities and thus make wars pay for themselves more and more. Britain eventually won the struggle against France for world supremacy on these fronts after the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763. But even though Britain had attained a competitive advantage over France, its world hegemony was not yet complete due to the systemic chaos from rebellious uprisings, especially in the colonies of the newly forming United States. According to Arrighi, Britain didn't become truly hegemonic until it adopted a free trade imperialism in the 1800s that expanded and superseded the Westphalia system established in 1648. Arrighi explains the Westphalia system was based on the principle that there was no authority operating above the interstate system. Free trade imperialism, in contrast, established the principle that the laws operating within and between states were subject to the higher authority of a new, metaphysical entity, a world market ruled by its own laws, allegedly endowed with supernatural power.
Laws of the market.
Yeah, laws of the market.
There's no power above, no pope or anything.
Right.
Being Protestants, it was important to them. But you needed to, after the Napoleonic Wars and the breakdown of that monarchy, the authority of monarchy as the heads of state, you needed a new authority, the market, the laws of the market. There's the market. But it's, again, capitalism is above the market. So it's interesting that it uses the words market to describe that. But and it skips over U.S. history, but that's how you can integrate U.S. history with this, to like the way wars pay for themselves, by having a war like the 7 Years' War and having America pay taxes to pay for it. But then that broke down, just because of the monopoly, because the corporations and the trading companies, they held trade monopolies. They were monopolistic. And that was important at the time to get things going, to colonize, to have one entity doing everything. And when that was basically, the work was complete, once America's developed enough, in the same way that East Asia's developing enough, they don't need to be a colony anymore. They don't need to be part of that system. I'm not a part of the system, man. Part of a new system, free trade system. And that's what Hamilton was all on about. Burr and Jefferson were more like, no, pastoralists, feudal, the land is the wealth, and
right.
but they were bankers, and they knew that the future was free trade. With the Napoleon system, like the last gasp of French, we're gonna, we've lost all the wars, but and of course they helped us win our win our independence. And it was interesting that, so again, this is in the era, the 7 Years' War is kind of the signal crisis for the Dutch system. In that, or at least in the, with the age of piracy, right? To bring it back to what we know in pop culture. The age of piracy was when you had wars that were more about controlling trade than territory. And that was when the Dutch system was the Dutch in particular were then moving to financialization. They were not producing, their colonies were not the profits of, or not the centers of money making. It was in funding everybody else. When it came to our war for independence, everybody was funded by the Dutch. They loaned to everyone. And it's the French financial situation with the salt taxes, and that's what really made everyone mad. And our tea taxes and stamp taxes was all the payback Dutch debts. And when we won our war, we were indebted to the Dutch. But it was too much, right? Because that's when the British struck back. And they pretty much took most of the Dutch possessions. South Africa, Malaysia, and of course beforehand, a sign of the times, New York was a Dutch colony that the English just took to say, we're getting as powerful as you. You can't fund something, your finance power isn't going to be able to stop us.
Interesting. Yeah.
Was greater than anything Pope and Emperor had ever mastered a medieval system of rule. This metaphysical higher authority in Britain's
Fuck
free
you,
trade
Pope.
imperialism was the monetary value of its assets, not the autonomous power of its rulers. This ushered in an entirely new kind of world empire that, by the 19th century, enabled Britain to wield a quasi-monopolistic control over universally accepted means of payment, world money, to ensure compliance to their commands, not just within their widely scattered domains, but by the sovereigns and subjects of other political domains as well. Although the emergence of Britain's world hegemony of free trade imperialism created the basis for the third cycle of capital accumulation, it was shorter lived than both the second cycle dominated by the Dutch and the first cycle dominated by the Genoese. Nonetheless, it was able to effectively control a political economic space larger than any previous world empire had ever accomplished before. U.S. hegemony in the long 20th century. By the end of the 19th century, the decisive factor in the struggle for world power was the size and growth of a nation's domestic market. For instance, since the United States had embarked on such an unprecedented and ruthless domestic territorialism against North America's indigenous people, it created a wealth surplus that was able to rival Britain's and eventually take over its hegemonic control over the world interstate system. As Arrighi put it, the United States developed into a sort of black hole with a power of attraction for the labor, capital, and entrepreneurship of Europe, with which the United Kingdom, let alone less wealthy and powerful states, had few chances of competing. This black hole of attraction developed such a deep-seated cross-fertilization of capitalist and territorialist logics of power in the U.S., especially domestically, that U.S. capitalism and territorialism were indistinguishable from one another. Arrighi makes clear, however, that the rise of U.S. hegemony in the 20th century was accompanied and enabled by the parallel rise of Germany as a formidable world power. Arrighi explains how Germany's rise was supported by its spectacular industrialization in military and industrial innovations since the 1840s. Nevertheless, this increase in military capabilities did not fundamentally change Germany's position in the world economy, large in part because Germany could not compete with the wealth created by the domestic territorialism of the U.S. Arrighi argues this drove Germany toward
They
a more
needed
obsessive
more
militaristic
space,
Yeah.
like America. But it was also it changed how their corporatism. Like we were both doing protectionism against English free trade through tariffs and whatnot. But it was, like I said before, ours was more vertical integration of companies in regional centers, and Germany was horizontal. But it was more like the whole Reich is a corporation with capitalists planning everything. You had a real planned economy, and prices were just a means of determining like how to move things around. Autarky, as it's sometimes called. Yeah, but his you can kind of tell by the page numbers he's citing that he's just going through the first 100 pages of the book, which is the intro.
So yeah, it's a pretty thick book, huh?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, that's 400,
approach across Europe with devastating consequences to Britain, but ultimately self-destructive consequences for itself. As he states, this obsession drove German rulers to try to first follow in the British and then in the U.S. path of territorial expansion. However, their attempts triggered a sudden escalation of interstate conflicts, which first undermined and then destroyed the foundations of British hegemony, but in the process inflicted even greater damage to the national wealth, power, and prestige of Germany itself. The U.S. benefited most from the outcomes of World War I and World War II, and eventually...
Pause again. So, but another thing that's part of the cycles is that the more capital accumulation you get, whether it's through production or finance, the more competition you get. The more intense competition is. And it's through that competition that capital then moves to the next thing. And by the next thing, I mean not just the next tech or the next set of companies, vertical farms, to AI, to other things. But not that way. But I mean in entire versions of investment, from production to just housing speculation, from housing speculation to whatever, maybe back in the manufacturing or something. But yeah, hard to know. But that will only occur after the next limit is reached. and competition will be fierce between state actors, only to be resolved by an even more powerful, encompassing state, an actual global state. That's one of the um, uh, projections of the book, or at least like here's one of the possibilities.
Yeah, and that seems plausible. We're at that point where we have enough energy to have a global state.
But essentially, like, you get these limits, and then that's when you have these big global conflicts. So, like, the whole, like, World War III just around the corner, like, well, does it seem like capital's reaching a limit of profitability? I guess they'll let us know when they do, and that's the next crash, or, you know, and that's sort of... But again, like, '09 wasn't one of these crises, you know? It's sort of odd when, like, the big thing of your life is still just like a little sideshow.
Yeah, it's a little blip, not the final.
But especially when you compare it to the chaos of 68 to 72, you know, that cycle was the really, you know, everything's going nuts cycle, political cycle. It's not like that. It really isn't. So, like, we're not at that point because we're not like, it's not going to be a total repetition, but like but that's the last time we really hit one of those limits, and capital had to shift completely.
Yeah.
But yes, we benefited greatly from the world wars because in 1900, it was American capital that was flooding Europe in investment. Like, in the same way that in the 80s, we're like worried about Japan buying America, and now we're worried about China buying America. It's because in Europe, the British were like paranoid about American companies and their investment in America in 1900, because especially with the war, global liquidity had completely, like, it used, like, there was this thing where, you know, because of their financialized economy, the British were buying everyone's debt, like they were the holders of everyone's debt. By the end of World War One, it's now the opposite. We're holding British debt, and Britain is paying their debt to us with German reparations, which you may know that part of the story if you know your World War II history.
Yeah. So thinking about getting to this limit with the current form of capitalism.
Yeah.
How long do you think before we realize we've hit that limit? Is it going to be, you know, decades into it, and then we'll look back and say, oh shit, I guess we did pass that point?
Considering it was sort of actually pretty abrupt. Well, the signal crisis... Well, yeah, that's the thing. The terminal crisis is always longer than the signal crisis. Okay. So when he uses... He made that graph with the long centuries, and determining how long each one really is. It was like, let's use the signal crises, because those you can put down to like a few years. Terminal crises are like decades. Like the time frame between the French and Indian War, just putting in American terms, a French and Indian War to 1812. Yeah. You know, that was the terminal crisis for the Dutch system and the establishment and the superseding of the British system. That was, you know, 30, 40 years. But let's just say in American history, we call the 1760s the age of unrest, right? Or from the 60s to the 70s. Sure. And it culminates with the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, war, revolution.
And then we have 5 years of Civil War, our War of Independence. And then you have in 81 the French Revolution, and then you have 20 years of chaos, basically. Resolved with the British establishing their, basically, you know, the concert of Europe, the power, the balance of power, which only broke down in the World Wars, essentially, because everyone was being protectionist and free trade was impossible, which meant British profitability was just completely tanked, and they couldn't fund their empire anymore. They had to let it go. So I guess the letting go part, say with the British, it took decades, right? There's this thing where it's like, when did the British Empire really end? And people like pick this date where it's when Churchill died and the Beatles hit their first record.
Okay.
But that's just the fun version.
Sure.
But yeah, terminal crisis will take longer, and climate crisis will certainly make sure that it's longer. But is it the climate crisis that's? I mean, it's a factor. It's probably going to take. It's going to be a part of it. But at the same time, actually, as other Marxists will point out, that thanks to the way capital can reinvest anywhere, that like you have disaster capitalism, green capitalism, that capitalism can very much weather the storm of climate change. That the logics are not damaged by ecocide. It can incorporate that damage into it. It will only end when we end it, right? Or when developments occur that make it that capitalist logic just can't hold anymore, and will shift to a completely new logic, an internationalist logic, or just a world market, dominated by East Asia, or at least managed by it, or something. Let's go. Yeah, let's continue. We're running out of time. But otherwise, I don't know. I can't really speculate. It seems like it's always 10 years away, or like every cycle, it just seems like it's getting more chaotic and crazy. But I don't know. We're still living our lives, and if I compared like the political, our situation compared to 2012, like the way the economy works doesn't change. It just ebbs and flows. Like we can say COVID changed everything, but that was really just a momentary interruption.
Yeah.
I always just see things in hindsight as being interruptions to the normal business cycle. In the same way that the boom times, post-war boom, was really just an interruption of sorts. That it was just 25 years of Keynesianism, and because of the chaos of the world wars, international capital was on the back foot. They had lost all control, and they had no control, and they needed states and planning to step up to stabilize things. And once things were stable enough, and it took that 25 years to clean up and stabilize things after the world wars, as soon as things are stable enough, boom, Wall Street sells New York, drop dead. Now it's their game again. And I guess we can see it the same way. Like, as soon as finance gets its way long enough, but things have developed underneath it enough, then there will be a switch. And it will take everyone by surprise, including ourselves, I suppose. But we can be it. How it happens and when it happens can be the surprise. But what we need to prepare for and think about. And so it's not a surprise when it happens. Like, oh, I was expecting this, I just didn't know when. In the same way, like, I was expecting a populist Republican, who's an outsider, to be like a major figure later. You could make that prediction in 2000.
Oh yeah.
Or as soon as Palin, becomes a star. Like, the love for Trump is an echo, a louder echo of the love for Palin.
Yeah, yeah.
And the love for Palin is sort of like the jovial love of Bush by the base.
Sure.
And that's an echo of Reagan, I suppose, but it goes by and on.
Sure.
In that case, nothing is truly that new.
Sure.
And everyone's comparing this attempted assassination to Reagan's attempted assassination. Again, it was just some loner who didn't know what he was doing. Yeah.
Who they don't really teach much about in the history books. Like, he may get a paragraph if we're looking
Reagan,
directly.
Yeah. Some people, he's the most important president.
No,
ever.
I'm saying the guy who tried to assassinate him.
Oh yeah, sure.
Like, his name doesn't even come to mind easily. So,
But long term, it won't matter.
Right.
Even Reagan and other presidents won't matter because I mean, who gives a fuck about President Tyler?
true enough. Yeah.
Even Jackson will have a paragraph, but it's mostly it will be about his war crimes.
Yeah.
And whatever. It won't be, and maybe banking. What's the role of banking in America? But that's just a matter of Jackson, and he was flashed up for a moment to represent territorialist America, and Hamilton and other presidents, Whigs, represent the capitalist America, the logic. But we were already combined, and by then, Elizabeth in England was already a fusion of capitalist and territorialist logics. That's what the English Empire is all about. And so then all empires are like that.
Yeah.
Except maybe Russia. They were still kind of territorialist and not capitalist. But that's sort of what made them so weak.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like any losers in the world power struggle is because they weren't fusing territory and capital logics.
Yeah, they're getting too hung up on territory. Yeah.
Yeah, and the losers of the British hegemony, like say China and other empires, large land empires, and Germany to an extent, they weren't fusing. They weren't. The corporation wasn't like they weren't doing it right. Because they weren't able to fuse things together like America was. Market and plan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like Germany was planning too much, Soviet Union was planning too much.
Sure.
We had it just right, so to speak. The New Deal.
Right. Struck that balance. How many minutes we got left? About...
We're in the bed. We're in the end.
All right.
Just finish up.
Yeah, let's finish it. We'll go to
the hegemonic power by the 20th century. However, just like during the rise of the Dutch and British hegemonies, the rise of the U.S. did not come without many revolutionary uprisings by various non-Western and propertyless people. Arrighi highlights that this revolutionary pushback by non-Western and propertyless people reached its apogee with the Russian Revolution of 1917 that fought back against free trade imperialism. Alongside this anti-imperialist pushback, the global political economic space after World War I became dominated by two opposite and antagonistic factions. A conservative faction dominated by Britain and France, oriented towards the preservation of free trade imperialism, and a reactionary faction led by Nazi Germany that was, as Arrighi put it, upstarts in the struggle for world power who had neither a respectable colonial empire nor the right connections in the networks of world commerce and finance. However, after World War II, the damage to the conservative faction and the reactionary faction led to the rise of the Soviet Union as a world power. The development of the Soviet Union pitted the USSR and the USA against each other in a bitter worldwide struggle famously known as the Cold War. Nonetheless, according to Arrighi, this dichotomous concentration of power that defined the Cold War period set the stage for the remaking of the interstate system to accommodate the anti-imperial demands of non-Western peoples and of the propertyless masses. Arrighi explains that, like the Napoleonic Wars 150 years earlier, the Second World War acted as a powerful transmission belt for social revolution which, during and after the war, spread to the entire non-Western world in the form of national liberation movements. In the aftermath of World War II, a period of what Arrighi calls decolonization occurred, in which all people who constituted themselves as a national community in the interstate system of commerce were granted the right to self-determination by the development of the United Nations. Under the leadership of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, the development of the United Nations was the first attempt by world powers to create a world government meant to supersede all forms of state authority by political means. Roosevelt called his idealistic vision of a one-world government controlled by the UN one-worldism. One-worldism paralleled the idealism behind the U.S.'s New Deal after the Great Depression, and included the USSR among the poor nations of the world to be incorporated into the evolving Pax Americana for the benefit and security of all. However, upon Roosevelt's death, his predecessor Harry Truman changed this idealistic one-worldism vision into a Cold War-inspired free-worldism, exemplified by the Truman Doctrine, that, as Arrighi states, institutionalized U.S. control over world money and over global military power as the primary instruments of U.S. hegemony. The U.S. hegemony, based on a worldwide monetary and military control, had fundamental differences from the hegemony of Britain's free trade imperialism. For one thing, world money came to be regulated by the U.S. Federal Reserve, acting in concert with select central banks of other states, which gave the U.S. much greater economic flexibility than the British government ever experienced under a privately regulated gold standard currency.
But that was just for the
according to
25
Arrighi,
years. So for 25 years, the money in the world was actually kind of more controlled by the public sector, by states. It's with their success in the stabilizing of the world system and economy that money starts flowing back into private hands. And once they have enough of it, then they start financializing the economy. With the euro dollar and then the petrodollar.
Sure.
And then all these other currencies. Money is flowing into these currency trading, which then becomes 20 times more value than all the trade in the world. You know, all the trade is $2 trillion in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
The money markets had 30 trillion.
That's
And now it's 200 trillion compared to the 50 trillion of the world economy.
Sure.
So it's a similar ratio. It's sort of it's put in terms of like we have all this world debt and there's no way we can pay it back. But that's not really like the profit making is occurring through the financial, like the money trade.
Yeah.
It's not from the trade. You're thinking only as a value in terms of labor value.
Yeah.
And
no,
use value. But that is not
something
capitalist
different.
logic. That is the other kind of logic. It starts with an S. Our logic.
Yeah, right.
So yes, it's good that we're thinking in terms of our own logic that is not capitalist. But let's make sure that we're not confusing how the ruling class and the capitalists are doing things, and not confuse it with how we think the world should be.
Right. Absolutely.
Or view the world to be as like when we're in our city and we see these market forces and market economy and stuff but that's just the market economy. That's all just the crops to be harvested by finance.
The most critical departure from British free trade imperialism, and what truly defines the long 20th century, is the development of U.S. transnational corporations. This corporate feature of U.S. hegemony is contended by Arrighi to be partially a regression back toward the technical virtuosity of high finance employed by the previously discussed class of Genoese merchant bankers, however with some unique differences. By 1971, after the disintegration of the Bretton Woods system, when Richard Nixon detached the dollar from the gold standard, U.S. corporations developed into transnational entities free from any state authority and had the power to subject its business rules and regulations on every member of the global interstate system. This power, combined with the size, insularity, and natural wealth of the United States, enabled its capitalist class to internalize not just protection costs and production costs, as the British capitalist class had already done, but transaction costs as well. That is to say, the markets on which the self-expansion of its capital depended. This new transnational corporate hegemony, supported and protected by the military-industrial complex of the U.S., is what Arrighi defines as the free enterprise system. As Arrighi explains, the emergence of this free enterprise system, free that is.
One last translation bit for me.
Sure.
So this is referring to that when parts of a corporation have subsidiaries in different countries, and then they can all do business with each other at with each other with no cost. They all have the same bureaucracy, and part of that lower transaction costs or no transaction costs comes in the form of bureaucracy and having multi-unit organizations, because the weakness of the British system was that all companies were still family companies. They were family owned or mom and pops.
Right.
And the corporation is not. It's more efficient. It combines, and that you have all of these single unit companies that just weren't doing well. And throughout the Great Depression of the Victorian era, the 30 years, this phrase used that you had manufacturers saying they were tired of working for the public. This is code for our profit margins are too low. Capitalists don't use that phrase anymore, and it's probably because their profit margins have always been really good now.
Mhm.
But that's how Americans thought of it when they weren't making enough money. They were working for the public, and that was the case so long until they had regional integration and trusts and whatnot, and that's why they built the trusts, and then they had to be busted, but that obviously just kind of reformulated what corporations would be doing and how they would operate.
Right. Indeed. Yep, that makes sense.
Balance, finding balance.
From the constraints imposed on world-scale processes of capital accumulation by the territorial exclusiveness of states, has been the most distinctive outcome of U.S. hegemony, and is the face of the long 20th century we find ourselves in today.
The money can do whatever it wants regardless of like where it is in the world.
You get up on your little 21-inch screen and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. What do you think the Russians talk about in their councils of state? Karl Marx? They get out their linear programming charts, statistical decision theories, Minimax solutions, and compute the price-cost probabilities of their transactions and investments, just like we do. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
Hey everybody, it's Peter Coffin, and
Well, that was a surprise.
Yeah.
So what do you think of all that?
Oh man, that's a lot.
It's a lot to wrap
in.
your head around.
It
It's
is.
taken me 2 months. That's why I've been ranting about it, like a mad, trying to wrap my head around it all. It's fun to it's fun to find a book after a while that I can like. Okay, I'm going to change my worldview because of this book.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
I'm going to integrate in my worldview. It's good to have a book to challenge me like that again, because it's been a while since I've read something, because everything has seemed kind of like this is just a part of it. I don't want just to understand a part. I want to understand all of it, because how can I know what to do without seeing the big picture? You know, what is capitalism doing at the high levels? Because otherwise we're just fighting whack-a-mole with the tentacles, the little ends of the tentacles, when really there's a head. Where's the head of the squid? The vampire squid.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, it's a little depressing, because the way it's presented is as though all of these things are just not
Have
so much
happened,
decisions, but
happened,
they're on
will happen.
rails. You know, it's like
Yeah.
history is on rails. It had to go through these different stages. There was no one who could have fought back against it effectively.
Well,
and it's going to continue on.
Well, no. Here's the thing that it really doesn't go into the social history so much, because again, we only do one thing at a time. This book is just doing one thing. You could have a companion book all about how, and by the way, it's a long book because he's going through all the ways that in each of these stages and the transitions that they are made up of hundreds of decisions being made by people doing what's best for them, or rulers doing what's best for their nation state, as well as, you know, he does kind of gloss over things like these, as well as this video does, like you have these 30 years of revolutionary chaos that upend the system. They did matter. They did a lot. They just didn't. It just seems like they were doing it for the development of the next stage of capitalism.
Right.
But it wasn't in service to it, though. It wasn't like planned out. You know, it wasn't like because throughout the Napoleonic Wars, like, you have English military industry going through their own production boom in the war industry and all that to fight Napoleon all around the world and take over the Dutch colonies and all that stuff, establish the British Empire. And yeah, I mean, if you were telling all of those French peasants chopping the head off their king and building the guillotine and all those middle class merchants basically fighting to almost establish their own bourgeois power, to establish free trade capitalism, because that's what needed to happen to them, and it's kind of what needed to happen with the end of profitability for Dutch finance capital. But they don't see it as this is what has to happen for the reasons of capitalism, for the sake of capitalism. We're all acting for the sake of our own our own ideas and beliefs about what constitutes a better world. That, you know, free trade is not just better for my pocketbook; it's better because it connects more people. And the political philosophy is and all those other writers are not writing just to justify the next stage of capitalism. They're not thinking in terms of that way, because they're thinking in terms of society. And that way capitalism is almost a sideshow in itself. That these are all human societies that just happen to have this underlying logic acting within it, not always like over it. Because like I've been trying to point out, that each of these eras have dialectics between markets and planning. And as socialists, we can say we're on the planning side. And with every action we make, that the socialists make for the planning economy, an economy that isn't for, you know, capitalist logic, we're affecting how the markets work, or how that resolves. And that is being done with all of our decisions and actions. And I think it's just to see that there are these trends. And I think our role is to prepare for that catalyst, that we don't have to be surprised about what happens. There'll be a surprise when it happens. We can be prepared for that, so that when it does happen, we can have an effect, that we can push things in the direction that we need to figure out what direction we want that to be. Just a world market economy, or we want it to be a world planned economy, or a world state, and we have, or is it like, as anarchists would want, that we dissolve we develop towards a dissolving of not only the capitalist layer of, you know, of dynamics, but the market layers, and we're left with that base layer of communities and local production economy and whatever. Sure. Which sort of seems like a nightmare of sorts, because if I think about it, that it's primitivist. It's like, without a world economy, like, what brotherhood do you have between people? You know, the communication technologies that link us together are a byproduct as well as an instrument of corporatism. You know, telecoms, mass media, artists are always doing things with all of that, and education and schooling and other institutions are always kind of a part of all of this. Schooling and the university is even older than capitalism, and so just as the monarchies, they kept existing.
That's true.
It's not just the long arrow, you know, like the Star Trek episode. Maybe I'm just spitballing a lining or a way of spinning, so we don't end up in some historical determinism like some Marxists did, and still do. But of course, they always look very silly, because it's like they're really ignoring a lot of reality and how things really work. Yeah. They're not being very materialist, actually.
No. They kind of ignore all the backsliding into more capitalist forms of production that so many
In a
of these
similar
cultures have
way,
gone through.
evangelical Christians are just as determinist. You know, the history has a linear path, and it leads to
Yeah,
the
right.
rapture
Yeah,
or God's kingdom, and blah blah blah.
yeah, and we don't want
And
to have our economics just be taken on religious faith.
yeah, of course.
So
Um, but they certainly are sometimes
yeah,
in those sectors of society. So yeah, okay, we've gone late enough. Just a little bit of my life. Things are moving with the band. We're learning.
awesome.
Well, they're really easy to learn, but we have Solidarity Forever and Hallelujah I'm a
One of the
Bomb.
best ones.
And
Hell
we're
yeah.
looking at other IWW Red Book songs. I want to figure out how to play Do It for Liberty, which is an anti-nationalist song.
That's one I don't know.
Right. There's no recordings of it like on
wow.
YouTube. So I don't know what the melody of it is. The Red Book I have has chords. His Red Book does have music sheets, so we'll see
that's
what's
fun.
there.
That's a fun challenge.
Yeah. So, but Do It for Liberty is like tie a flag around your eyes so you cannot see. Tie a right around your ears so you don't have to hear. And and then after a few verses, it's like then they'll tie a flag around your coffin and put you on the ground.
Oh wow, that's powerful.
It's like we'll tie a flag and you'll go to war and do it for liberty.
Yeah.
I don't know the melody, but it rhymes.
Interesting.
It's about tying a flag around and you just keep tie your flag around your
Right.
waist.
Ends up binding you completely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. That's exciting. I'm excited to see how that turns out.
Yeah, doing a Green Party picnic. We'll see if more than 5 people show up, but it seems like with summer,
Good luck.
everyone always has other plans already.
Yeah.
So the ideal, if I'm doing my job right, but I have 2 weeks to figure out and act. But I want to go through my call list. But it seems like every goddamn weeknight there's something else to do.
Something else craps up. Yeah.
Or I'm invited to I'm gonna have lunch with dinner with a fellow Green tomorrow.
Cool.
We're gonna talk about an idea he wants to do, taken from someone else, called Vote Pack,
Okay.
which is that, I guess, in a similar vein as the French elections, like libertarians and Greens will. Well, I guess it's meant to be a meetup where libertarians and Greens meet up, talk, and commit to voting for our prospective third parties, I guess. I'm not sure. It's meant to be in the form of a speed dating event.
Wow.
So I'm going to talk to him about it and maybe watch whatever video he watched to inspire him. But I did just meet someone who's been organizing speed dating events for the last few months. A new person doing it. So, and that's what he was asking for. Someone, do you know anyone who has put together speed events? And I'm not someone good at organizing events, but this picnic is on me, because again, the people who'd help me are off on vacation all the time, being world travelers, and it's kind of annoying, but I'll see what I can do. All right, so
cool.
That's on my plate, and thinking about how I'm going to. It's so daunting thinking about it as someone who's alone. But part of the picnic is to get more acquainted with the people who help petition, so we can do some goddamn Stein outreach. I guess we're just sort of kind of waiting to know for sure if we're writing campaign in New York. If I want to distribute lit, I want to make sure that's on it. Which is different than regular Stein lit, but at the same time, we should probably just get out there and go.
Start.
But I don't want to overload myself, and especially since it's been so fucking hot. I think this may be one of our. There may be others, of course, but this is the last really hot day. It was over 90, but it may be the last for a while, at least maybe a few weeks. So, maybe things will be better.
Yeah, maybe.
I'll have the will to lit drop and do other outdoor things.
All right. Well, good luck with all of that.
Good luck with your studies.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's tough, but I think I'll get through it. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, look forward to next time.
Yep.
Until then.
God save America. God save Biden. God save Trump.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one.
No political violence.
No political violent advocacy here. Yes.
Later.
All right. Have a good one. All right, y'all. That's going to do it for me as well. Thanks for tuning in. And I will hope to see you all Sunday. I got caught up with school stuff this last Sunday, so I was not able to stream, but I'm trying to get back in the saddle Sunday, if not sooner. Do some more Legend of Zelda. I've been very busy since the last time I did that. So, we'll see though. Alright, until then, have a good one.